The man known to history as Emperor Trajan was born as Marcus Ulpius Trajanus on the 18th of September 53 AD at Italica in the Santiponce region near modern-day Seville in the Roman province of Hispania Baetica, which stretched across what is now southern Spain. The year of his birth is not entirely certain. He may have been born a few years later or earlier, though the date of 18th of September is largely undisputed. Trajan was named after his father, Marcus Ulpius Trajanus. The gens Ulpia were an ancient Italian family who hailed originally from Umbria. Although the timeline of Trajan's father's career is not entirely clear from the available sources, we do know that he rose to become a member of the Roman Senate, the leading political body in the empire. This probably occurred a few years before Trajan's birth, his arrival coinciding with his family's rise socially and politically. Trajan would become the first Roman emperor born outside of Italy. Despite being born outside Rome, he was of old Roman ancestry, the colony of Italica having been established by the great Roman general Scipio Africanus 2.5 centuries earlier during the Second Punic War. His mother was named Marcia and came from a plebeian family or Roman commoners, but one which had risen during the late Republican period to a position of wealth and influence. She was effectively a noblewoman of sorts by the time she married Trajan's father. Her position as Trajan's mother would become more significant years later when Marcia's sister, Furnilla, married Titus Flavius Vespasianus around 63 AD. Titus's father, Vespasian, would become emperor of Rome in 69 AD. Thus, in his early adult years, Trajan benefited enormously from his aunt being a member of the imperial family. Trajan was born when the Roman Empire was nearing the centenary of its establishment. Its great territorial expansion had largely occurred under the Roman Republic, when generals like Scipio Africanus, Gaius Marius, Cornelius Sulla, Pompeius Magnus, and Julius Caesar conquered the entire Mediterranean world between the 3rd and 1st centuries BC. It was Caesar's adoptive heir, Octavian, who brought the Republic to an end and created the Roman Empire in 27 BC, adopting the name Caesar Augustus in the process, although he cloaked his political innovations by appearing to simply make himself the first citizen of Rome. Yet in reality, Rome now had a supreme ruler, and members of Augustus's extended family succeeded him as emperor after he died in 14 AD. Soon after Trajan was born, Emperor Claudius, a great-nephew of Augustus, died under somewhat suspicious circumstances in October 54 AD, bringing the Emperor Nero to the imperial office at just 16 years of age. Though well regarded at first, Nero became, by some accounts, a loathed ruler on the basis of his lack of respect for the Roman Senate, an institution which, although it had lost a huge amount of its power under the emperors, still expected its traditional rights and position to be honored by the imperial family. The failure of numerous rulers to do so early in his life paved the way for Trajan to become emperor of Rome one day. Despite being born in Hispania, Trajan did not spend much of his life living in the Iberian Peninsula. At an early age, he was sent to Rome. Although we have little information concerning his early years, it seems probable that he was tutored by numerous scholars in the subjects which were deemed most important for a successful political career amongst the Roman elite, namely rhetoric, oratory, philosophy, political science, and literature. Trajan's family lived in considerable comfort during this time, with archaeological excavations of the Trajanus family residence in Rome having revealed that the villa was large and commodious, even by the standards of the Roman elite at the time. After spending much of his youth in the capital of the empire, he quite possibly returned to Hispania in the mid-60s AD, as his father served as the governor of their native province for a time between 64 AD and 65 AD. It was an indication of Trajan's father's rise and the family's wider political significance in the south of Hispania that he was appointed to govern the province of Hispania Baetica, a gubernatorial term carrying with it immense prestige at the time and being one of the ultimate goals of any Roman senator's career. In the years that followed, as Trajan entered adulthood by the standards of the Romans, who did not have any conception of the idea of being a teenager, times were turbulent across the empire, though Trajan's family emerged in a stronger position. In the year 66 AD, a massive revolt broke out amongst the Jews of Roman Judea. This compounded discontent with the reign of Nero, and 2 years later, simultaneous revolts amongst governors and military commanders in Spain and on the Rhineland frontier led to the overthrow of Nero. He took his own life, and a new ruler, Emperor Galba, assumed power with the assent of the Senate. This, though, was only the beginning of unrest, and in the year 69 AD, there would be multiple civil wars, as Galba was overthrown by Otto, who was then replaced within a few months by Vitellius, a military commander who marched south from the Rhine frontier to claim the imperial title. Vitellius, in turn, was himself defeated by Vespasian, a member of the gens Flavia, who was in charge of suppressing the Jewish revolt when the civil wars erupted, and who utilized the legions under his control to gain power in December 69 AD. Thus, at the end of what has come to be known as the Year of the Four Emperors, Vespasian emerged as the new emperor of Rome, establishing the Flavian dynasty. As we have seen, Trajan's family were related by marriage to the Flavians, and so Trajan's career prospects brightened immensely. Trajan was still a young man at this time, and thus his ascent was gradual. In the 70s AD, he began a military career, something which was intrinsically part of a political career within Roman society, as conquest and rule over other peoples was so inherently part of the Roman psyche by the 1st century. His initial postings were in the east, where his father had gained honor under Vespasian for serving for a time as governor of Syria, one of the wealthiest and most significant provinces of the entire empire. While there, Trajan acquired the position of tribune within one of the legions under his father's command. This made him a senior military officer in charge of managing the legion's affairs. It was followed by assignment to the Rhine frontier, where a great many legions were stationed during the Flavian period. How the border operated here is still a major point of debate amongst classical scholars. While the Rhine was dotted with fortifications and walls, the legions often moved east of the wall into enemy territory, to either attack fractious tribes or to protect trading stations which were maintained beyond the frontier. Although we have few sources with which to shed light on Trajan's activities here in the 80s AD, we can assume he was involved to some extent in these frequent border skirmishes and missions. Meanwhile, in Rome, there was a quick turnover of emperors, as Vespasian died at a relatively old age in the year 79 AD, only for his son and successor Titus to die after little more than 2 years as emperor, leading to the succession of his brother as the Emperor Domitian in the autumn of 81 AD. Trajan's career particularly flourished during the reign of Domitian. He spent many years on the Rhine frontier, eventually being promoted in the late 80s AD to the position of legate, a type of general who was the senior-most commander of a Roman legion of upwards of 5,000 men. In Trajan's instance, he was placed in charge of the Legio 7th Gemina. He was in command of this unit on the Rhine frontier in the year 89 AD, when a Roman senator and military commander named Lucius Antonius Saturninus attempted to launch a revolt against Domitian by winning over some legions on the frontier and allying with the Chatti, a powerful Germanic tribe who lived just beyond the border. Trajan was prominent in suppressing the revolt and gained respect from Rome in doing so. His quick actions probably ensured that in 91 AD he was elected to hold the office of consul, the most senior magistracy in the Roman state. The consuls generally served a term as governor of a province after their consulship as a reward for having attained to the peak of the Roman state. It is unclear if Trajan served as governor of one of the provinces along the German frontier or of Pannonia, a province lying around western Hungary and the border of Croatia today. But what is wholly evident is that by the mid-90s AD, he had become a respected and important figure amongst the elite of the Roman Empire. He also married during this period, though the exact year of the union is not known. His wife was Pompeia Plotina, Like Trajan, she hailed from Hispania and came from a family which was of Italian origin and had been part of the colonization of the Iberian Peninsula. A traditional and down-to-earth woman, she and Trajan had a close relationship, though it does not appear to have been a romantic one on any level, as Trajan was decidedly homosexual. Indeed, his sexual promiscuity was such that he elicited more than a few wry comments from observers in his own time and outright insults from 3rd and 4th century writers as attitudes towards homosexuality changed in the late imperial period. Beyond his sexuality, we know surprisingly little about Trajan's personality. Cassius Dio, a Greek historian of the 3rd century, who is a fairly reliable source on the reign of Trajan, states that he was known for being a just and balanced person, one who was simple in his habits and not prone to the kind of ostentation that had made so many previous emperors such as Nero unpopular. While Trajan's career was on the rise in the 90s AD, the same cannot be said of Emperor Domitian. After a promising start in his first years, Domitian had apparently fallen prey to the same failing that had ended Nero's reign. According to historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius, who lived through much of these events, Domitian displayed a heightened lack of respect for the Senate and the patrician class of Roman aristocrats who made up its membership as his reign proceeded. By the mid-90s AD, he was highly unpopular, and on the 18th of September in the year 96 AD, he was assassinated in a conspiracy which clearly involved elements amongst the Senate, the staff of the imperial household, and the Praetorian Guard, that were the only military force allowed around the city of Rome itself. With his death, the Senate quickly moved to elect a well-regarded Roman senator by the name of Marcus Cocceius Nerva as the new emperor. This set a precedent, and for over half a century thereafter, the Roman emperors would often be chosen on merit rather than solely through family connections, a system which had led to the period between Nerva's accession in 96 AD and the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD to be termed the reigns of the 5 good emperors. Nerva's election as emperor by the Senate in the autumn of 96 AD was something of a stopgap measure. He was already an aged man in his mid-60s at the time of accession, and it was fully understood that he would not be emperor for long. Furthermore, he was not universally popular. Nerva had been close to the Flavians for decades, and for some he was tainted by his links to Domitian. He was also unpopular with the military. It was this which led Nerva in the summer of 97 AD to make plans for the succession in a way which would also shore up support for his own reign, however long it might last. Perhaps it is unsurprising that his mind turned to the popular commander in Germania. Trajan soon received word that Nerva had adopted him as a proposed successor. Additionally, he received the title of Germanicus in recognition of his command and governance of the Rhine frontier. He did not have to wait long for another title. Nerva died in late January 98 AD, just months after appointing Trajan as his successor. Trajan began making his way south towards Rome, his unhurried march perhaps indicating a wish to shore up support amongst the legions of the Rhine frontier, or alternatively, he was so confident of a smooth succession that he felt there was no rush to proceed to the capital. The latter proved to be the case. Despite the unconventional succession process, no challenger emerged, and Trajan became emperor at the age of around 44. Although he would unquestionably become one of the most significant imperial reigns of the entirety of Roman history, we have a somewhat unsatisfactory range of sources from the time to draw upon for details of his rule. All of the emperors from Augustus through to Domitian had their reigns and even their personalities described by near contemporary and highly accomplished historians, notably Suetonius, who wrote biographical lives of the first 12 emperors, and Tacitus, a Roman senator, whose annals and histories describe the history of the first century of imperial rule. Both of these writers largely stopped at the transition from Domitian to Nerva's rule. Accordingly, for the 2nd century emperors like Trajan, we are largely reliant on histories such as the monumental work of Cassius Dio, a Greco-Roman historian, and the anonymous Historia Augusta. The problem with these is that they were written long after Trajan's time and the reliability of the Historia Augusta is very questionable, the anonymous author or authors never allowing the truth to get in the way of a fantastical story. Unfortunately, an account of Trajan's war with the Dacians, a separate account of his clash with the Parthians, written by Arrian, and a book which Trajan's personal physician, Creton of Heracula, wrote on his reign have all been lost since antiquity. Nevertheless, these losses are compensated for by the unusual survival of some of Trajan's letters to the governor of the province of Bithynia, Pliny the Younger, and also the documentary evidence provided by the column which Trajan erected to commemorate his war with the Dacians. Trajan quickly established himself as a popular ruler among the Roman people. There were two elements that quickly expanded his popularity within Rome and Italy itself, though these did not extend empire-wide. One was the expansion of the alimenta, a welfare program which Nerva may have begun to introduce, but which Trajan rolled out and expanded. It was a multifaceted scheme, one which provided state aid in the form of food subsidies and payments to the poor, orphaned children and widows. Other elements of the alimenta aimed to redistribute land and to provide relief to indebted landholders across the Italian peninsula. It is important to bear in mind that at this time Roman citizenship, and with it the ability to enlist as Roman legionnaires rather than auxilia or non-citizen soldiers, had only been extended to the inhabitants of Rome and Italy, not to the provinces, although many people further afield received grants of citizenship for service to the state. Consequently, some historians have argued that the alimenta was designed by Trajan as a way of relieving poverty and encouraging family growth across Italy, as a means of bolstering the population numbers and expanding the manpower available to the state. Whatever the motive was, it was a popular measure, as indeed was the other prong of Trajan's populist program. This saw Trajan investing heavily in popular entertainment in Rome, specifically gladiatorial contests in the Colosseum that had been built under Vespasian and opened by Titus, and chariot racing in the Circus Maximus. Despite the popular view of the gladiatorial contests as being the beating heart of Roman entertainment, chariot racing was actually more popular at the time. Trajan invested heavily in renovating and expanding the Circus Maximus, an already enormous venue which would hold up to 250,000 people. While welfare and games won Trajan the affection of the common people of Rome and Italy, there was more than one constituency of people which a Roman emperor needed to please in order to be successful. As the examples of earlier emperors such as Nero and Domitian had proved, it was best to keep the Senate on one side by respecting their traditional privileges. What this meant in effect was allowing their members to engage in the cursus honorum, the career progression through the various magistracies, such as tribune of the people, questor, and then the consulship, the highest political office below the imperial title itself. Trajan did this and deferred to the Senate in such a way as to maintain the loyalty of the senators. Often this simply meant consulting them on issues which he had already made up his mind on, but the pageantry of consultation and the idea that the Senate was an active partner in government alongside the emperor and the imperial staff was important in maintaining harmony. Further afield, he cultivated good relations with the elites of individual provinces and cities by respecting their right to adjudicate on matters concerning their finances, courts, and other issues internally, without referring too many matters to Rome, something which Pliny the Younger's letters make clear was particularly appreciated in the Greek Eastern Mediterranean. Finally, Trajan also engaged in the common imperial practice of broadcasting his greatness as a ruler to his people through a public building program, something which Augustus had pioneered and which many emperors had subsequently attempted to one extent or another. In Trajan's case, the centerpiece of his construction program at Rome itself was a new forum. Over the past century and a half, several rulers from Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus to Vespasian and Nerva had overseen the construction of forums in the center of Rome, between and across its 7 hills. These were large spaces where monumental temples, civic buildings, and open spaces were constructed and laid out as public areas meant to celebrate the reign of the ruler who built them. The Forum of Trajan was the grandest of all the imperial forums in ancient Rome. Built between the Quirinal and Capitoline hills, it required the removal of hundreds of thousands of tons of mud and rock before the space was leveled. Thereafter, a grand basilica was built, along with an open marketplace and meeting site, all paved in expensive Carrara marble. 2 public libraries were also constructed on the Forum, while in later years after his death, a temple was erected dedicated to the memory of Trajan. Further afield, Trajan built numerous palaces around Rome and refurbished the roads leading out from the city to other parts of Italy. In the provinces, he appears to have ordered a particularly large amount of building projects to be undertaken in Egypt, notably a canal between the River Nile and the Red Sea, to facilitate trade and passage across the eastern desert. One unusual, though especially noteworthy construction project which Trajan was responsible for was carried out far away from Rome on the lower reaches of the river Danube, straddling the modern-day borders of Romania and Serbia, near the Romanian city of Drobeta Târnu Severin. There, with Trajan's support, a monumental arch bridge was built over the river Danube. It was designed and the construction was overseen by Apollodorus of Damascus in Syria, one of the leading architects of the time. Completed in the year 105 AD, the bridge spanned 1,135 meters, making it what is believed to have been the largest arch bridge to have been constructed anywhere in the world until it was surpassed well over a millennium later by edifices such as the causeways that the Aztecs built to connect their capital, Tenochtitlan, in the middle of Lake Texcoco with the mainland. A large bronze statue of Trajan adorned one side of the bridge, while military encampments were placed on either end, an indication that whilst this was a monumental achievement from an architectural perspective, the bridge was also built for a functional purpose, namely the intended conquest of Dacia to the north. As impressive as the bridge was, it only stood for not much more than a century and a half and was destroyed by the Emperor Aurelian in 270 AD as a military maneuver by the emperor during the civil wars, which racked the empire for decades in the middle of the 3rd century. Some of the huge stone pillars which were used to hold the bridge arches up are still visible in the landscape and under the water of the Danube today. Such construction work and generous bequests on the people of Rome did not come cheap. Trajan's government was expensive, and it became even more expensive in the second half of his reign as he engaged in a series of costly wars. As we will see, some of this was offset by the acquisition of extensive gold mines in Dacia in the late hundreds AD, but the emperor was nevertheless spending beyond the means of the imperial exchequer at the time, when, by some estimates, military spending accounted for over half of the state budget. To pay for all of this, Trajan and his officials had to recourse to devaluing the coinage. The standard Roman coins, known as the denarius, were generally made out of pure silver. During times of economic pressure, emperors would instruct the treasury officials to bulk out the silver with other metals. Trajan did this, and studies of Roman coins from his reign indicate that the silver content dropped from around 94% purity to under 90%. A drop of 5% might seem small, but this was a slippery slope, and in the course of the century that followed, the reduction of the silver content became so extreme that it caused rampant inflation and eventually a profound economic crisis across the empire. Trajan bears some of the blame for popularizing this method of dealing with a budget shortfall. One final element of Trajan's domestic policies is noteworthy. Although neither he nor contemporaries would have believed it to be anything other than a curious distraction from the day-to-day business of government, this concerned the rise of Christianity, a religion centered on Jesus Christ. Theirs was still a minor religious movement by the early 2nd century, though it was growing in many cities and towns in the eastern Mediterranean. It was here that the governor of the province of Bithynia and Pontus, Pliny the Younger, in what is now Turkey, found himself dealing with some disruptive Christians in the year 112 AD. This led him to write to Trajan, asking him what he should do with these particular individuals who seemed to think that there was just one true God, and that their prophet was some sort of heavenly Messiah. Their crime was most likely refusing to pay homage to the emperor and the Roman gods. Luckily, well over 200 of Pliny's letters have survived, and some of these shed light on his and the emperor's approach to the Christians. The overwhelming sense that we get from these is of confusion and indecision about what should be done with these strange monotheists and their belief in a single god. Trajan effectively advised Pliny to ignore them if at all possible, but if they engaged in incendiary behavior, they should be punished, potentially with death. Thus, Trajan's answer to a problem which would become ever greater in the decades that followed was to not make a problem for the government if one wasn't clearly presented. Though if the authority of the state was questioned, exemplary punishment should be used. A final very significant development during these years was Trajan's decision to continue the policy of promoting a suitable heir, rather than allowing an immediate family member to become emperor after him. The decision was partly made for him by the fact that his marriage to Plotina did not result in any children. It is unclear if this was a result of Trajan being sterile, Plotina being barren, or a lack of sexual intercourse between them owing to Trajan's sexual orientation. Regardless, he could have looked to a first cousin or some other near relative as his successor, as Augustus and his successors had, but instead he chose to adopt a less closely related cousin. This was Publius Aelius Hadrianus, whose father was Trajan's first cousin, making Hadrian a second cousin of the emperor. The boy had been orphaned in 86 AD, and Trajan had taken him under his wing, overseeing his education at Rome and later sponsoring his entry into political office in the mid-90s AD. It was Hadrian that delivered the news to Trajan on the Rhine frontier in 97 AD that he had been adopted as Nerva's heir. In around 100 AD, he married Trajan's grandniece, Vibia Sabina, in a clear sign that he was being groomed as Trajan's potential successor. The marriage was arranged by Trajan's wife Plotina, who had grown fond of Sabina as she spent several years in their wider household. However, he was never formally adopted in the way Nerva had adopted Trajan as his successor. Instead, there was a tacit awareness of Hadrian's position as the leading candidate to become the next emperor. Though Trajan never confirmed this, perhaps because as Hadrian advanced into his late 20s and then 30s, some divisions appeared between the two men, not least owing to Hadrian's unusual affinity for Greek culture, something which was deemed problematic in the Western Empire, where Roman martial and conservative values remained somewhat different to those in the Greek East. While Trajan's domestic policies and building program were popular, he was best known in ancient times and has been ever since for his foreign policy and conquests. When he ascended as emperor in 98 AD, the Roman Empire had been largely static for the better part of a century. This was owing to Augustus's injunction to his successors against expanding the empire further. In the year 9 AD, 5 years before Augustus's death, a large Roman army of over 3 legions had been completely destroyed by a confederacy of Germanic tribes in central Germania, while trying to extend the Roman frontier to the river Elbe. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, Augustus had ordered the legions back to the river Rhine and commenced the construction of fortifications all along the Rhine and the Danube, which would henceforth act as strong northern borders. He then commanded his successor, Tiberius, not to engage in further conquests. This situation largely prevailed down to Trajan's time, with the Sahara Desert forming the southern border, the Atlantic Ocean to the west, and Rome's perennial enemy, the Parthian Empire, to the east, controlling Mesopotamia and Persia, around modern-day Iraq and Iran. Only in one region had Augustus's advice been ignored. In Britain, where the Emperor Claudius had undertaken a conquest a decade before Trajan was born, one which was still advancing slowly north into what is now Scotland, even when Trajan became emperor over half a century after Claudius first ordered his legions over the English Channel. Trajan was not interested in completing the conquest of Britain, perhaps having learned from the example of Domitian's early reign, when the Caledonians of northern Britain had demonstrated how obstinately they would refuse to be conquered. Instead, his primary goal in the early part of his reign was in reducing the kingdom of Dacia in what is now Romania. The Dacians, under their ruler King Decebalus, had been a thorn in the Roman side since the mid-80s AD. when there had been a war between the two powers, but Domitian had failed to defeat them, his legions in the region losing the Battle of Tapae in the year 88 AD. Trajan was determined to conquer them once and for all, a policy which would serve to secure the Roman border in the Balkans and also give the Romans control over the gold, copper and iron mines which lay within the kingdom of Dacia, perhaps alleviating the fiscal shortfall which had been created through Trajan's populist domestic policies. It was with an eye to a future campaign against the Dacians that Trajan ordered the construction of the Danube Bridge early in his reign. Even before the bridge was built, Trajan launched his first war against Dacia in 101 AD, not long after settling his government in Rome. This first war was a short affair, one which ended in a Roman victory of sorts, though Decebalus managed to negotiate peace terms in 102 AD before Trajan, who had led the campaign in person himself, could advance on their capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia. Under the terms, he agreed to become a vassal king that would pay tribute to Rome and cease disturbing the peace along the border. The terms did not hold for long, and so in 105 AD, Trajan prepared his forces for a new war, this time able to utilize the new bridge over the Danube to flood Dacia with tens of thousands of troops. The campaign was not a minor one against a small polity. The Dacians were a highly militarized people, able to field well over 100,000 warriors. They were unable to deal, however, with the superior tactics and weaponry of the Romans, and in 106 AD, Trajan conquered their capital, acquiring a huge trawl of gold in the process. Decebalus fled and apparently took his own life. Thereafter, Dacia was made into a Roman province, one which was heavily colonized and Romanized. So successful was this policy that it is the only eastern province of the empire where Latin would form the basis of a dominant modern language, Romanian being a Romance language like French, Italian and Spanish, while the very name Romania is reflective of Rome's lasting legacy in the region. Upon his return to Rome from Dacia, after conquering Decebalus and his people, Trajan ordered a procession known as a triumph, and 123 days of celebratory games in the city. The more enduring commemoration of the military campaign followed in years to come, when the emperor had a great triumphal column built in the middle of the forum he had laid out years earlier. Trajan's column is one of the most iconic Roman monuments still standing, largely as it was built 2 millennia ago in the center of Rome. The column is about 35 meters high altogether, consisting of 20 very large cylindrical marble drums stacked one on top of each other and then surmounted by a statue of Trajan himself. Although the original statue was lost at some point in the medieval era, and the statue which stands on top of the column today is actually of St. Peter and was placed there by Pope Sixtus V in 1587. Architecturally, the column is an immense achievement. The main block at the top weighs over 50 tons, and had to be lifted to a height of well over 100 foot in an age before steel cranes. More broadly, the marble drums are somewhat like the Bayeux Tapestry, recounting William the Conqueror's conquest of England in the 11th century, in that they offer a pictographic narrative of the Dacian wars and Trajan's conquests. The images are also a major source of Roman military history, as they provide some of the best depictions of Roman legionaries and auxiliary troops available from ancient times. 106 AD was not just an important year in terms of the final conquest of Dacia. This was also the year that the Roman Empire annexed the Nabatean kingdom. The Nabateans were a Bedouin people who had emerged out of the Arabian desert to form a substantial polity in the 1st century BC, one which for a time controlled parts of the Levant before the Romans conquered those regions. By the time of Trajan's accession as emperor, they still ruled over lands that now correspond with modern-day Jordan and much of the northwest of Saudi Arabia, as well as having influence in the Sinai Peninsula. The Nabatean kingdom flourished in the 1st century AD by becoming a client state of Rome's, and one in which peace and prosperity allowed for the construction of the magnificent sandstone rock-cut tombs, religious buildings and civic centers at Petra, now a World Heritage Site. In 106 AD, the last king of the Nabatean royal line, Rabel II Soter died. This led to the annexation of the kingdom by Rome, a development which may have been simply part of the wider process of transforming client kingdoms into full provinces, a process which had been underway since Augustus's time, or may also have been undertaken through military pressure applied by the governor of Roman Syria, Cornelius Palma, acting under instruction from Trajan. Whatever the exact circumstances, this led to the creation of the province of Arabia Petraea. Trajan's annexation of the Nabatean kingdom led to a further expansion of Rome's trade networks eastwards. Although the Parthian Empire had blocked Rome's eastern expansion for 2 centuries by his time, trade had flourished down the Red Sea from Roman Egypt since the days of Augustus, with one writer of the period, the geographer Strabo, asserting that 120 ships or so sailed every year from the Red Sea ports into the Erythraean Sea, the ancient name for the Indian Ocean. There is even evidence of a Roman temple having been built in southern India. Despite these antecedents, Trajan's annexation of the Nabatean kingdom saw a further expansion of Roman trade eastwards, with new ports being utilized in the Gulf of Aqaba and control being established over the caravan route that ran from western Arabia all the way north towards the Levant. With this, the people of the Roman Empire would have noticed a decrease in the price of luxury commodities which were imported along these trade routes, such as incense, frankincense, and sandalwood. All of this added to the prosperity of the empire and the popularity of Trajan as the emperor. As much as the conquest of Dacia and the annexation of the Nabatean kingdom would have galvanized and burnished Trajan's reputation in his own time and for the decades to come, it was with his campaign against the Parthian Empire to the east that Trajan truly cemented his status as a great emperor in the eyes of the Romans. The Parthians had been a perennial enemy of the Romans for 2 centuries, ever since Rome expanded into the Levant and advanced to the border of Parthia. But unlike in places like Gaul and Germania, where the Romans had faced disorganized and fractious Celtic and Germanic tribes in Caesar and Augustus's time, in Parthia the Romans faced an advanced, centralized state with a developed bureaucracy that could finance the raising of large armies. Furthermore, the Syrian desert had always presented an impediment to successfully campaigning into Mesopotamia. Yet Trajan became determined towards the end of his life to succeed where many others had failed. In 113 AD, he began preparing for war, pulling legions away from the frontiers and recruiting new cohorts of troops and auxiliaries. Then in 114 AD, he marched into Armenia, a buffer state in the Caucasus which had switched its allegiance continuously between Rome and Parthia over the years. Here he removed Parthomasiris, a Parthian prince who had been installed in Armenia by the king of Parthia, Osiris I. Trajan was in no mood for conciliation. He simply had Parthomasiris killed and then annexed Armenia as a province of the empire. In 115 AD, when Trajan marched with his legions south into Mesopotamia, he was the first Roman emperor ever to do so. The campaign which followed in 115 AD and 116 AD has the distinction of being the most successful ever waged by a Roman commander against the Parthians. Trajan marched south between the 2 great rivers of the region, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the summer with upwards of 11 legions and auxiliaries if sources are accurate, an army which with other supply staff would have been upwards of 100,000 men or more. That autumn he conquered northern Mesopotamia by securing the cities of Nisibis and Batne and allying with a local ruler, King Agbar VII of Osroene. He then organized the region into the new province of Mesopotamia, a demonstration of his determination to remain in the Parthian lands. However, he still had yet to face a fully engaged King Osiris. The largest clash between the Roman army and the Parthians would not occur until 116 AD. Trajan wintered at the end of 115 AD in eastern Syria, before campaigning back into Mesopotamia in the spring of 116 AD. In a striking campaign, his legions seized some of the foremost cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, using numerous ships that had been pulled overland, placed on the rivers so that he could sail down them. The speed with which he was able to travel with a large contingent of the legions took the Parthians by surprise, and their capital of Ctesiphon, not far from modern-day Baghdad, fell in the summer of 116 AD. Thereafter, Trajan was even able to sail down the rivers to the Persian Gulf. Writing back to Rome, he wistfully noted that Alexander the Great had campaigned much further east, and it is possible that Trajan had sent out envoys to some of the local leaders of the tribes around the Zagros Mountains and Persia to see what the possibility of reducing them to Roman rule might be. A counteroffensive ended any hopes of this, and the remainder of 116 AD was spent trying to consolidate control over Parthia by deposing Osirus and installing a puppet ruler, Prince Parthamaspates, as a Roman stooge that could placate the local elites. Trajan clearly intended to form Mesopotamia into two provinces ruled directly by Rome. However, news from the west completely undermined his ambitions. While Trajan was beginning his campaign into Mesopotamia against the Parthians, an old internal enemy within the empire was preparing to take advantage of the distraction offered by the war to seek revenge for a long-standing set of grievances. One of Rome's great weapons as an imperial power, much like the empires of Britain and the United States in modern times, was its soft power, its ability to co-opt and pacify different people across the known world by promoting the benefits of Roman culture and rule, things which included running water from the aqueducts, good roads to travel on, entertainment in the local amphitheaters, and the prosperity brought by peace and extensive trade. Nearly everyone fell under the spell of this soft power. An exception were the Jewish people of Judea and their diaspora around the eastern Mediterranean in cities like Alexandria and in places like Cyrenaica, Greece, and the coastal cities of what is now Turkey. The Jews were uncomfortable with the manner in which Roman culture mocked their traditions, and the Romans, for their part, found the Jewish monotheistic religion and cultural practices peculiar. Jewish attempts at freedom were repeatedly put down, until the first Jewish revolt occurred in Judea in response to decades of heavy-handed Roman rule, which included repeated acts of desecration of the Temple of Jerusalem, the center of Judaism at the time, and one which was destroyed in 70 AD at the height of the revolt. Thereafter, the Roman state actively persecuted the Jewish population of the empire, imposing a tax known as the Fiscus Judaicus on all Jews for decades to come on the basis that it was used to offset the cost of suppressing the revolt years earlier. It was especially incendiary that the tax of 2 denarii per person annually was equivalent to the half shekel which all observant Jews had paid in times gone by to the Temple of Jerusalem before it was destroyed by the Romans. There is some evidence that Nerva might have moved to reduce these anti-Jewish laws during his brief reign, but they were reintroduced with a vengeance by Trajan, an emperor whose views on the Jewish people may have been colored by his experiences in the eastern provinces in his youth, not long after the first Jewish revolt. Hence, while the Roman authorities took something of a lax approach towards the monotheism of the Christians during Trajan's reign, the same was most certainly not the case when it came to Roman policy towards the Jews. In 115 AD, with Roman legions being removed from many provinces and sent east to fight the Parthians, a huge new Jewish revolt broke out. This did not have its origins in Roman Judea itself. Instead, it emerged from amongst the Jewish diaspora communities, seemingly beginning in Cyrenaica, in what is now Libya, and then spreading east into Egypt, where there was a very substantial Jewish community in the city of Alexandria, the second largest city in the empire, second only to Rome. From there it spread to the island of Cyprus and eventually Judea itself. The Kitos War, or Second Jewish Revolt as it is variously known, is a notoriously difficult thing to study, as the primary source accounts are almost certainly unreliable and tainted by an anti-Jewish bias. Thus, they suggest that hundreds of thousands of people were killed by the Jewish rebels in Cyrenaica, Egypt, and Cyprus. While these figures are hard to accept literally, particularly so since they come from Cassius Dio, writing a century later, there is no doubt that the revolt was extensive and required an emergency call-up of some of the legions remaining on the Danube frontier to head to the Mediterranean to sail to Cyprus and North Africa. Overall, it created a major disruption while Trajan was trying to finalize his conquest of Mesopotamia. The Jewish revolt had necessitated that Trajan cut short his campaign in Mesopotamia, and he made his way back towards Syria and Judea with several of his legions to provide extra military reinforcement for suppressing the widespread rebellion. He was there by early 117 AD, even as the revolts in North Africa and on Cyprus were being brutally crushed in a wave of pogroms and mass executions. With the situation stabilizing and having appointed representatives to try to manage the new provinces in Mesopotamia, he set sail for Italy. However, now in his mid-60s, his health had been declining for months, exacerbated by the intense military campaign against the Parthians. Thus, on the voyage from the Levant across the Mediterranean, the party was forced to make port at the city of Selinus, near the modern-day city of Gazipaşa in Turkey. Here, a possibly emaciated and run-down Trajan took to his sickbed. He never recovered and died there on the 11th of August 117 AD, not far short of celebrating his 20th anniversary as emperor. When he died, the succession issue was still not fully resolved. Hadrian had been groomed as a potential heir early in the reign, but the relationship between Trajan and he had cooled over the years, and Trajan had certainly not made it unequivocally clear that Hadrian should succeed him as emperor. It is probable that he would have favored someone else had his wife Plotina not been set on Hadrian becoming emperor, a development which she wished to see occur in part to ensure that Trajan's grandniece Sabina ended up as empress. Thus, in Rome, Plotina took steps to make sure that Hadrian was now declared as emperor. Hadrian himself displayed his ruthless streak in the months that followed, by overseeing a purge in which he had any potential rivals, men such as Lucius Quietus, a military commander whom Trajan had left in charge of the legions in Mesopotamia and the east, discreetly murdered. Thereafter, Hadrian followed the by now traditional practice of declaring Trajan to have become a god in the afterlife. Beyond this ritualistic deification, Trajan's reign had been so popular and seemingly successful that henceforth it became a saying amongst the Roman senators and other individuals within the political class to hail a new emperor by saying Felicior Augusto, Melior Traiano, which transliterates as, "May you be luckier than Augustus and greater than Trajan," a clear statement of the belief that Trajan had been the greatest of Roman rulers. The events which followed immediately after Trajan's death reduced the ostensible success of his reign. On the one hand, the Jewish revolts across the eastern Mediterranean were quickly suppressed by the end of 117 AD, although another would follow in Judea itself just over a decade and a half later. Conversely, his costly conquest of Mesopotamia turned to dust when Hadrian quickly decided, on the basis of the outbreak of numerous revolts and the re-emergence of Parthian resistance, that trying to hold such distant lands against powerful opposition was pointless. He abandoned the new provinces and largely withdrew to the pre-war borders. Thereafter, Hadrian became an emperor who favored administrative and social reform, touring the provinces extensively for much of his 20-plus-year reign, rather than engaging in warfare like his predecessor. The empire continued through the decades of prosperity in the middle of the 2nd century under Hadrian and his successor Antoninus Pius. But from the reign of Marcus Aurelius onwards, cracks began to show in the empire as Germanic tribes such as the Marcomanni and the Sarmatians threatened the Danube frontier, the beginning of 3 centuries of barbarian migrations which would eventually bring about the end of the Roman Empire in its original state. Part of the crisis which began to envelop the empire in the 3rd century in particular was brought about by a combination of a fiscal crisis caused by the devaluation of the coinage, which Trajan had been a key figure in the inception of, and also by the overt militarization of the empire which he favored, and which led to a succession of seemingly endless civil wars from the 190s AD onwards. Trajan was perceived by the Romans as the greatest of their emperors. While Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus were the preeminent founders of the empire and its imperial glory, Trajan was viewed as the one ruler who had eclipsed them. While Caesar was assassinated before he could finish the works he had started, and where Augustus had suffered a major military reverse in Germania towards the end of his reign, Trajan had been virtually undefeated in his lengthy reign, and had added a host of new territories to the empire. Above all, he was the only Roman ruler or general of either the Republican or Imperial eras who had managed to comprehensively defeat the Parthians, where many others, like Marcus Crassus and Mark Antony in the days of Caesar and Augustus, had tried and failed. It was this military prowess, combined with his populist domestic policies back in Rome itself, which led contemporaries and later Romans to refer to him as the greatest of their emperors. And yet, from a modern perspective, there were some failings to his reign. These include his nefarious approach towards the Jewish community of Judea and the Eastern Mediterranean, one which led to a massive revolt at the end of his reign. Perhaps the most significant of all failings, however, ones which could not have been foreseen in an age where understanding of economic policy and social economy were very limited, was that his devaluation of the coinage and his expansion of the Roman military promoted the problems which would emerge decades later in the Roman state, and would begin the downfall of Rome's empire. What do you think of Emperor Trajan? Was he the greatest of Rome's emperors, as the Romans largely believed, or should he be judged more as an effective military commander but a poor administrator, who sowed many of the seeds of Rome's crisis in centuries to come, through his populism and military campaigns? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.